Welcome back, everyone. Well, we're on to the final leg now. So, you're the hardy few, so well done. Well, the hardy quite a few, actually, so well done. I'm sure a few more people will wander in a little while. We're going to talk about world-class DC in this session, and I have on the stage with me three frighteningly intelligent people. So if I look like I'm struggling, it's because I don't know what they're talking about. It would be really useful if you could come up with some questions and help me along with it. And of course, you can submit those questions through the app or put your hand up. It would be great to get some audience participation, just like it was during the pensions question session. And of course, there's the roving mics around. This is a live streamed session as well. So again, hello to everyone at home. And you can submit your questions through the chat box, I think it's called. So my children tell me. Now, you'll all know Gregg, of course. We've seen Gregg on stage several times this conference already. So you'll all know Gregg, but perhaps the other two speakers up here you'll be less familiar with. So let me introduce them to you. The obvious one in the middle is Catherine Harvey. Catherine is an American, and she is with the AARP, Public Policy Institute, which, to break the acronym down, and I don't think you use this anymore, but it was the American Association of Retired Persons. Although now they have a much wider brief, and their mission statement is to empower people to choose how to live as they age, which I think is a great mission statement. So we can talk more about that later on. And on the far end of the sofa is Martin Fahy. Now, Martin is the equivalent of Julian Mund in Australia. So he's the chief executive of the mine's gone blank. Australian Superannuation Association. ASFA.
It's okay.
ASFA.
I went on live public radio last week and got my own acronym wrong.
Well, then I feel much, much better about it.
Yeah,
ASFA.
It's not a good start when you do it to yourself.
And ASFA have a great conference like this in November, and this year it's in Melbourne, isn't it? So that'll be a great thing, and you'll be going back to that before too much longer. So what we're going to do is 45-minute session. Each of the speakers is going to talk for 5 or 7 minutes with a few slides. They're going to do that from the sofa, and then we're going to go into a discussion around, well, world-class DC. So start thinking of your questions. And Gregg, you're going to kick us off.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I think it's still morning.
Yep.
For the last 3 or 4 years, the People's Pension has been engaged in a research project to understand better pension systems around the world, and from that study to learn any lessons, either good or bad, that the UK DC system can learn. We're now reached volume 3, which will be out in all good bookshops early next year. To be honest, they've not been bestsellers. and if you have any interest, tap me on the shoulder, because giving them away has proved to be difficult, never mind selling them. The method we follow really is that I and colleagues edit these publications, these books, and we find academic experts on different national systems to write about their systems. And the broad approach, as you'll see from the slide, is not economistic or quantitative. It's political, cultural, social, which I would shorthand define as, if you want to understand pension systems, you can't just look at the numbers, you have to understand the underlying forces which shape a country, because a pension system always exists within that national context. And our national experts seek to provide that distinguished expertise to understand systems. So we've reached 19 countries now. I'm happy to discuss the esoteric details of the Greek pension system if anyone wishes to do so. But to give you a flavour of the kind of authors, Jeremy Cooper, the very well-known analyst of the Australian system, has written about Australia in Volume 1. Keith Ambachshire, who's really the guru of institutional pension fund governance, has written about Canada in Volume 3, and so on. So that's the approach. What about the evidence? What would I say? So we look at lots of different aspects, but I would suggest from our experience at looking at these countries, in particular the DC systems in Latin America, Australia, Western Europe, you find very quickly that systems are going through a process of change in their attitudes towards what delivers good outcomes. Very pertinent in terms of the panel this morning, which I thought was a really fascinating session, because it takes us quite quickly into a view about engagement. One headline would be, there isn't any world-class system which depends on engagement for good outcomes. Engagement is low everywhere for the reasons that were talked about this morning. It's really an aspect of human nature to struggle to think very long-term about pension saving. But it takes governments and policymakers time to get to that conclusion. So if you look at, say, Mexico and Chile in the Latin American context as early DC adopters, and the Western European systems in the UK, of course, as part of that, really go through 4 stages in DC policy development. The first is to assume that pensions is like any other market. So if you let people have lots of choices, they'll act rationally and they will act in their own best interests. That doesn't last very long when confronted with the reality of behavioural biases that are universal to all of us, and that becomes clear quite quickly. You then tend to get stage 2, which is, okay, people won't act rationally, defined as what long-term saving for the retirement at reasonable levels, therefore will force people to save. And when I use mandatory, I'm including auto-enrolment in the quasi-mandatory space. So Martin will talk about the Australian system, which is compulsory, of course, but I see mandatory more broadly than that. That gets people saving. But still, governments and industry and policymakers struggle with moving away from that kind of efficient markets view, that people make very good choices in the mobile phone market or in electronic consumer goods or so on. So why can't they do that in pensions? The answer, I think, as we talked about this morning, is that pensions is a different kettle of fish because of the complexity and the long-term nature of the product. Governments then redouble their efforts via transparency and education. So the view is we must keep trying, and there was a flavour of that this morning, and there's been a flavour throughout the conference, and you get it in all systems. Like, we really got to make sure that people engage. It's in our own best interests. They need to be making choices, keeping us honest in a sense. As an industry, we need to get them to do it. Finally, governments come to the conclusion that that doesn't work either. It certainly doesn't work in isolation. And therefore, you end up with the kind of interventions that I mentioned there. And we know in the UK context, you can see the relevance. I would bring out competition for the market, because that might seem very abstruse. One way to look at that is the Chilean system that was the first DC individual account system from the early 80s. It's now moved to an approach where whenever a new cohort enters the system, young people, the government asks for sealed bids from the providers and chooses the lowest bid in terms of AMC and all-in costs. And that provider gets all the new members. And the reason they went to that approach was competition in the market, free competition, individuals choosing, was leading to suboptimal outcomes. People were being persuaded by marketing to change provider. It basically became like a merry-go-round. And we all know in pensions and investment, not switching is so important. It's like house purchase. You know, all the costs add up, the transition costs, transaction costs, charges for leaving, charges for joining. So they've moved to a system in Mexico as well as Chile, where the regulator has very strong powers to narrow the terms of competition, because free competition hasn't been effective. State-mandated provider Nest in the UK, they haven't quite got there in some of the other countries. So just finishing, because I know we want to have a good discussion, I think outside of state pension, the challenges are these, and these are the challenges to engagement, and I think we're all aware of them. Weak regulators is in the context that regulation is really difficult, I think. The incentives and regulators to intervene before something goes wrong aren't very strong, because you don't get any credit if you stop something happening. Until it's happened, awareness of the problem is not significant. And I think really these are the challenges in workplace pensions. And I would finish by saying 2 things. Firstly, I think the fundamental question for the UK is, are pensions, and maybe glosses is auto-enrolment pensions, a retail financial product or an arm of social security? Bear in mind that the disappearance of the second state pension, the flattening of the state pension, reflects a policy view in government that auto-enrolment then provides that income that has been lost via the collapsing of the second state pension, the flattening into a flat rate pension. And this question, I think, has fundamental implications for how we think about workplace pensions. So if they're an arm of social security, they need to be heavily regulated, and that's the direction we've been moving in the UK in the workplace. And final point, the session last night on world-class DB schemes with the Dutch and the Canadians and Railpen, I thought was fascinating. And for anyone who was in that session, it was very clear that the panel agreed that the fundamentals of high-quality world-class systems, DB, but also DC, are governance in the member's interest on an unconflicted basis, scale and consolidation. Easy to say, harder to do, but they are the fundamentals.
So I can add some lowbrow things. Interesting fact, the Chilean system was designed by an actuary sitting in Berkshire. Catherine.
Thank you, Richard. On that note, I'm not sure where to take it, but I'll just play the cultural novice here and the American delegate to the conference. I haven't met another US representative here today, so I'll try my best to give a quick overview of our DC system, as it were. But before I do that, I'd like to introduce a little bit more about who I am, who we are. The AARP, as Richard said, has evolved over its 60-year history. We are a non-governmental organization. In fact, we're the largest membership organization in the world, largest nonprofit membership organization in the world, with 38 million members. Our members are not pensioners necessarily, they are consumers, mostly over the age of 50. Receiving your AARP card or the invitation to join AARP is a rite of passage in the United States. We also have the largest circulation magazine in the country, and we tend to feature celebrities, including some from across the pond, on occasion. We advocate on behalf of people over the age of 50, whether you're a member or not. So we work on issues of health, wealth, and self. That third pillar, self, is in a different wing of the building from those of us who work on public policy issues and issues like pensions and retirement, which is where I sit. But occasionally we have some fun and we get to see celebrities pass in the hallway, and the occasional survey going out about where people like to vacation in the summer. That's in the self category. Wealth is where I work, and I'll speak to that today. Overall, I would also mention that we place a great importance on the exchange of ideas internationally. AARP participates in task forces with the OECD, the World Economic Forum. NEST in the UK has been a great partner of ours for sharing information and ideas about how to innovate the retirement savings space. I think it's important to just give an overview to show that we have a shared backdrop here. This is the aging population in the United States, of course, also globally. In 1960, people over the age of 65 were 9% of our population, and they're projected to grow to 24% by 2060. Our system of DC pensions, or as we call it, the DC retirement system in the United States, has a similar three-legged stool approach as the UK system. Many people may be familiar with our social security system. This is sort of our basic pension system, earn as you go. It's a progressive system that has a higher benefit amount for people depending on their earnings. That makes up about a third of the retirement income of today's retirees or households age 65 and older. The pension system, which is that blue slice, the 20% of income, that includes both DB and DC pensions. And similarly, we've had a massive trend toward DC, away from DB plans, over the past 10 to 20 years. Our DC system has currently 100 million people in it and $7.5 trillion in assets. That includes savers who are working as well as retirees. As far as our contribution level, we have a 6% average contribution level among people who are in the system. When you include the employer match, which is not mandatory, that bumps it up to about a 10% total contribution level. A couple major differences between the UK and the US system that I think are important to highlight. One is that we don't have mandatory auto-enrollment and we don't have full coverage. Only half of our workforce actually has access to a workplace pension plan. DB or DC. So 50%, 51% of our population just doesn't even have the option to save through their employer. They miss out on the tax-provided benefits, any employer match to that contribution, and their option really is to go shop for what is called an individual retirement account that has some post-tax or some tax benefits. Very few people do that. As we know, behaviorally speaking, they're just not incented to go and proactively shop in that market. Those tend to be higher priced, higher fee products as well, and really relegated to more sophisticated investors. We do have a move and a growing recognition of the importance of automatic enrollment among those DC plan providers, among those employers who do have a plan. About half of our workforce is auto-enrolled right now among the DC plan providers. The other major difference between the UK and the US system is that there is no income floor for participation, although depending on the your employer, you do have some eligibility rules for participating in the system, in the plan, that effectively leave out a lot of lower income workers, in particular disadvantaged small business employees and self-employed, as we discussed this morning. One shared challenge I want to talk about today is the challenge of adequacy, saving enough to fund these longer lifespans so that people can have not just the longevity, but also a longer quality of life. There are a few particularly promising strategies that we see to deal with some of our shared challenges. I want to lay out three challenges. The first is the changing nature of work. The gig economy came up this morning, but I think it's important to put in context that the gig economy, while it is a small sliver of the current workforce, there's actually quite a bit of wage and income volatility that results from scheduling practices. So people who are in retail, who are on-call workers, who may not be self-employed or gig workers, but are working for employers who do not have predictable schedules. This is a major issue in the United States. In fact, we find that about half of households have a 25% swing in their income 5 months of the year. So that's half of our households who do not know where that next paycheck is coming from and aren't sure that they can meet their obligations short, medium, and long term. So that's an important challenge. We also have a widespread financial fragility that's now permeating up just from is no longer relegated to the lowest income spectrum, but is now up the income scale. We have about 40% of households in the US who would struggle to come up with a cover a $400 financial emergency. Someone this morning mentioned the short-term savings shortage. This really gets at that lack of a financial cushion that everyday households have, and that puts pressure on our DC system. We do allow loans and withdrawals, most employers do, from our DC pension plans, and in some cases, people do tap into their pensions early to cover these financial emergencies. If they don't have access to a pension, they tend to end up in high-cost credit situations and a cycle of debt. And then the final challenge we're facing in the US, which I know is not unique to us, has to do with the growing levels of household debt. And how does the DC system respond to that pressure? In particular in the US, we've got a growing share of the older population who is still paying off their own student loans or taking on student loans for their children, and a growing share of the older population that has mortgage debt. So this is on our radar as challenges that our retirement system needs to address. I'll just end with 3 principles that I think are important to DC systems in the United States that could be imported and exported and have been across the pond here. The first has to do with auto portability, a pension or a pot that follows you from job to job that you can keep track of and continue to contribute to regardless of your employers becoming even more important the more jobs people have. And so that's something that we're looking at in the United States. Reaching the small business employer and reaching that self-employed worker is also a high priority. And ensuring people have access to at least a portion of their saved earnings is becoming increasingly important. What we have going on in the United States is that states, not the federal government, but state governments are taking up programs. 10 states have enacted a legislation to allow a payroll deduction automatic enrollment retirement savings plan for people whose employers do not offer them a plan at work. California is the largest state to have done this. Within California's plan, companies of 5 or more employees, so very small companies, are mandated to participate by facilitating payroll deductions in this plan. So you're reaching down into very small companies. And self-employed workers can opt in. So we're watching that laboratory of democracy, which is our state plans. The last thing that I would urge this audience to look at, because I haven't heard a lot about it, is not only the demographics of aging, but the demographics of the changing face of the workforce. In the United States, communities of color right now are the minority, but by mid-century, we're looking at people under 18 to be the majority of people of color. And eventually the majority of people over the age of 60. These same communities are underrepresented in our pension system. And so it's an economic imperative that we do targeted outreach and investment to get people engaged with their retirement savings and included in the retirement savings system, because the future of the viability of our pensions and also the retirement security of the US population depends on it. So for the UK, I know you have about a 13% minority population. I would urge you to not only do cuts of gender and occupation when you're looking at the success of your pension system, but also look at job characteristics and race and ethnicity characteristics to really dig down on and build a targeted outreach strategy around that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Catherine.
Thank you.
Well, I know I've got loads of questions starting to bubble up here and on the app, so you keep thinking about them, because I think there's some really interesting material to explore there. Martin.
Thank you. If you can maybe get over the cognitive dissonance of an Irish person talking about the Australian system to start with, that's probably the starting point. Very briefly, to summarise the system, it is universal in that it applies to everybody in the system. So about 75% of people are covered by superannuation in Australia. It doesn't include earnings below $450 per month or the self-employed. It's a compulsory system in that it's 9.5% on ordinary time earnings, legislated to go to 12% in the coming 5 years. And it's a predominantly DC system with 2.9 trillion Australian dollars or 1.45 sterling across what are probably about 20 large funds, which account for 80% of FUM. But we've got 6 funds which are greater than 60 billion pounds sterling, and we have a large number of those. So it's a compulsory defaulting system tied to the modern award system. And I suppose to go back to Gregg's earlier question, at the heart of public policy questions in Australia is the question which he posed, which is superannuation or the pension, is it a financial services product? And is that what you're regulating? Or is it, and I'm not sure it's a social security issue, I think it's an ideological question about the privatization of retirement savings and retirement risk. And they're the things that influence it. In terms of a world-class DC system, if you find one, please let us know. Most of us, it's a bit like Anna Karina, a perfect world-class DC system, all of them would look the same. The reality is all the broken ones, and Australia is not necessarily broken, but it's not perfect. They're all broken or have shortcomings in different ways. So let me talk about what we see as the key challenges to Australia's DC system. And there's a long laundry list, but I've picked out a number, and I promise to get this done in about 4 minutes. First one is, can a group collectivist construct, what we know, and Gregg has said this, is that scale, where you bring together large pools of savings, and by scale I mean 50 billion pounds and more. Scale where you can internalize, where you can build capability, where you can hold illiquids and alternatives, and you can internationalize a diverse asset allocation. How does that survive in a world of individuals and a market of one? How do you reconcile the, if you like, competing at scale for a small pool of assets where listed markets are becoming hyper efficient? How do you compete and still deliver personalization? That's our first big challenge. And that speaks to all the issues around engagement and good engagement and bad engagement, etc. The second one is, can defined contribution pensions, and Catherine talked about this, embrace the changing nature of work and how effort is organized in the economy? very much on the same page as Catherine. This is not about the gig economy. This is about how we organize effort in the economy. And one of the features of effort in the economy is that the share of income captured by labor in the last 10 years, according to McKinsey, depending on what sector you've been in, has essentially flatlined or declined. If you've been in capital, the share of income going to capital has gone up in some cases. And so that's having huge effects in terms of the interplay between DC systems, insecure work, real wage stagnation, whether compulsory enrollment, etc., erodes wage increases or not, and that's a debate we're having at the moment. This one came up yesterday and every moment of this conference. How can we address the vexed issue of unacceptable differences in outcome for men and women? It appears that DC systems exacerbate the gender gap in retirement outcomes. And it's particularly difficult with the increase in incidence of late life divorce, growing longevity challenges, and more, the fastest growing homeless sector and people living below the poverty line in Australia are older women. Not a good outcome. And you can attach it to traditional gender pay gaps. You can attach it to what we value in the economy versus what we reward. You can talk about broken work patterns. You can talk about dialing up, dialing down. Look, if we continue this headlong rush down to DC systems, women will pay the price. Can we make the transition from the DB mindset to the DC mindset in terms of the promise? A defined contribution system is a weak promise. And in regulatory theory, the intensity of the promise will be matched to the intensity of the regulation. What regulators say is, it's not about the promise, it's the fact that it's compulsion, it's the nudge that then authorizes the regulatory impost. Well, there's lots of things in life have are compulsory. Your social welfare system, your education system, we pay for lots of things that don't work, but the regulatory impost is very different there. And I think we need to be clear about what the conceptual framework that informs the promise. But also, I think there's a DC mindset in terms of asset allocation, which is understanding. And in the Australian system, that means 21% to Australian listed equities, 23% to international equities, 8% to cash, 4.5% to infrastructure. We've got listed property, but a big allocation to alternatives. And depending on where the funds are at a collective level with demographics, it can be as high as 48% allocations to alternatives, and all that goes with that. How do we effectively deliver advice in a world of modest balances? Nobody's got the answer. Digital, how we use digital, where does that advice come in? How can we make it affordable? Again, if we don't address these issues, you don't end up with a world-class system. So these are the exam questions which DC systems around the world are trying to answer. How do we manage community expectations, activism, public interest groups? There's a bifurcation of people's connection to funds management industry and the pension industry under a DB system and a DC system. What we know is that, if we look at tobacco-free portfolios, which have been a wonderful Australian sort of global initiative, now over 4.7 trillion in pension assets that are tobacco-free. The reality is that we are hearing, at some point in time, the rule of law, let me reverse that. At some point in time, this euphemism called social license, okay, and community expectations is at odds with the rule of law. And, the incidence of property rights and individual freedoms, and I'm not talking about tobacco, I'm not talking about the sort of challenges that we see with ESG. I'm talking further along the scale in terms of the spectrum around disinvestment and boycott. And those things are starting to raise real public tensions in Australia. And in the ESG space, the current coalition government has looked to re-examine the sole purpose test in terms of how funds have participated in discussions around environmental investment in the coal, extractive industries, but also in the recent debate around marriage equality. And so as the battle for workers' capital and pension socialism heats up, and it's not about financial services products and it becomes about the ideology of privatization of retirement savings, the spectre of Drucker's 1974 pension socialism comes back full and center. The changing nature of investment governance, internalization, internationalization, but increasingly in Australia, private capital markets and the illiquidity premium, persistent at 150 basis points, mainly derived from sovereign awards of monopoly licenses to run assets with one entry point and one exit point that you can capture economic rents for over 45 years. And the challenges that arise from a governance point of view, the challenges that arise when we eventually emerge from a low yield, low interest rate environment, and what that means for the governance around this issue in terms of valuations and comparability. And all of that means, and those questions that we've raised, is that our DC system, particularly in Australia, it may not be broken, but it's got these really big challenges that it's trying to address. And I think the challenge that we have is that we can draw certain lessons from different parts, but I think we are, context and genealogy, to borrow Gregg's point, matters. The system that you end up with is a function of the context within which it has been deployed and the genealogy of your culture and your society. And so the Australian one is a lucky country, 28 years of uninterrupted economic growth, more gas than Qatar, more oil than a Middle East country, more uranium than most West African countries, and more iron ore than Brazil. It would be hard not to make it work. But we are struggling, and we are currently the subject of a large amount of media and public policy criticism because we're not addressing these challenges.
Thank you, Martin. Right, well, so there's been a lot of focus on what could be fixed in various markets. So apart from let's just get some more oil and more uranium in the UK, there's a lot of practical questions in here. What can we do physically to try and improve member outcomes? So what's your top tip from your respective jurisdictions, or one of the many jurisdictions you've looked at, Gregg? And what's your top tip for what we could practically do without a change in the law in the UK to improve member outcomes?
Changing the law, I guess that changes it. I mean, I would say positively, the UK workplace system is in a better shape on the DC side than it was a decade ago. Auto-enrolment, moves to improve governance, increasing scale, although that's got a long way to go. So I would say we're actually in quite a good place. I would always go back to governance. We still have a bit to go in the UK. Because members don't engage, and that's the reality, we might want to change that, but that is the current reality and has been basically forever. You have to get governance in their interests. Who are the institutions acting on their behalf? In Australia, the success of the Australian system lies in these large sector-wide industry funds that are run collaboratively by trade unions and employers. We don't have that model. The People's Pension is an exception in that regard. We don't have that model. So who are the people on behalf of members who are looking after their interests exclusively? The sole purpose test, as it's called in Australia, the fiduciary obligation in the US. And I think we've made a lot of strides in the UK, but that's got to get better, and that's where scale comes in. There are only so many good trustees to go around. A lot of them will be here. And also, to do your job most efficiently in a pension scheme, you need that scale to allow professionalisation and to lower cost and to get into those kind of sophisticated markets that Martin suggested. So I would say continue the focus on governance, move towards a system where all workplace pensions are protected by trustee law, improve trustee performance. I know that's a controversial issue and it's not straightforward, but I think scale is the key thing. So I would focus on governance first and foremost. I see it as governance on one side, engagement on the other. Governance is a much better bet for all the reasons discussed this morning and yesterday, last night on the DB panel.
Okay, brilliant. Catherine, have you a thought?
I find the Nest trial of a sidecar savings model quite promising. For those not familiar, this is a recognition of that pressure I talked about, where households do not have the emergency savings to deal with even a modest expense. Nest has gotten a couple of employers to pilot a dual stream payroll deduction, one going into the traditional pension and a smaller contribution going into a liquid savings pot that can be drawn down in the event of an emergency, and the consumer gets to name that emergency. The idea being, let's harness the success of automatic enrollment and regular payroll deductions and the habit of savings and help people build their own emergency savings pot. In the US, this is an idea that my colleagues David John and leading behavioral economists at Harvard and Yale are also pursuing, and I know they're examining the Nest pilot, both with and in tandem with the retirement system and separate and apart from the retirement system. The power of the moment of pay has not to be overlooked, and the role of employers in helping people follow through on their intentions to save is something I think we shouldn't take lightly, and that the pensions industry ought to continue to look at going forward.
Sorry, go on, Martin.
I might take a slightly different view. We don't support sidecars. And we don't support sidecars, and we believe that the mischief that they are designed to address should be addressed at the public policy failing where they are. And the public policy failings that sees people left indebted and living below the minimum wage and homelessness and housing affordability. The answer to every question in Australia, there's two answers to every public policy question in Australia. Put it in the year 11 curriculum and get superannuation, put money into it. Okay, and so out of self-interest, and I'll park that, we are anti-sidecar. We believe that the dilution, to take the nudge, the successful nudge that is compulsory superannuation, and to use it then to deploy what might be, some might see cynically as other choice architecture issues that have ideologically difficult, etc. So we're a little bit anti on that. Gregg's got tickets on himself in terms of the trustee model. We like the trustee model in Australia. Intellectually, I'm challenged by the trustee model because in a DC system, because the promise is weak, there's no loss-absorbing capital. And so what you've got is in Australia is we've taken a legal structure called a trust, which is designed to protect a widow and two orphans, and we've weaponized it to the tune of 200 million Australian dollars. And we've said that is a viable entity through which you can deploy good governance and bad governance. I don't see a causation and a causation in particular between the trustee model and good governance. I think what's happened, what we've seen is that internalization, the principal agent problem does not go away under a trustee model. And there's a reason nobody's won a Nobel Prize for solving the principal agent problem, because it's really, really hard. And so I think we need to be careful. The success that we've seen with the trustee model in Australia, the success of the profit for member funds as they're called, but I think I'm a great believer in markets and price signals and innovation and competition and competitive intensity, and I think that's important. We are very alert to this question of financial hardship. One of the things we get challenged in Australia, they say you can't go to 12% because it'll erode real wages growth, and somebody who's out there living pay packet to pay packet, doesn't want their superannuation increased, and it's not fair. Okay, if you think it's not fair, why don't you give her a wage increase? Don't take it from what is a great system. So I think we've got to be very careful on some of these issues.
Although I think actually you're in agreement, we've got to fix financial resilience.
Absolutely.
Just to explore, we're going to go to the floor in a second, so if you've got a question, do stick your hand up and we'll get a mic to you. But before we do that, how does the American loan system work then?
The loans against 401k? Yeah, so the DC system is primarily made up of 401k, which just refers to the tax code. Depends on the employer, but most employers at this point do allow loans against the 401k. The interest is about a prime rate, and the saver actually pays themselves back. The interest goes into their own account. Interestingly, we were just looking at this recently. The data shows that people continue to make payroll contributions while they have a loan out. So it's very much a black box what people are using loans for. Some people may be using them for large purchases, such as a deposit on a first home. Healthcare is often cited as one of the reasons. There are also hardship withdrawals allowed. So these are pre-retirement withdrawals that you can make without penalty. But if you withdraw before retirement for any other reason, you are taxed on that, and there's a 10% penalty under the DC system. And I'd also just want to add and echo that we are, I think, on the same page about financial resilience, and that the jury is still out on Sidecar. And also, we're pursuing solutions that have nothing to do at all with the retirement system, but just still enable the employer to be that central hub of financial wellness for folks.
It has a really big impact on US DC outcomes, the ability to take money out. It's a debate here about access.
Yes.
The money doesn't go back, and certainly the gains are lost that would otherwise been had. in a chapter in the US by Professor Alicia Munell from Georgetown, she calculates that on average, for every member in USDC, the pot is 25% less than it would otherwise have been if there wasn't an access facility on an average basis.
Yes, this is commonly known as leakage. We like our water metaphors, liquidity leakage, and we're all adrift. But I think there is still something to be learned about what's the larger public policy or sort of fixed pot of finances that a household has to work with. Where are the shortages and how can we best address them?
Okay, I'd quite like to explore why the employer has a say in this, but we'll leave that for the time being. Were there any questions out there? Anybody have a question? There's microphone number 1 over there. It's Andy.
Thanks. Andy Cheseldine, Capital Cranfield. If you were to choose one element of policy from a country that isn't yours to import into your country, what would that be?
I might start off. The great vexation, the most vexatious problem we've had has been multiple accounts. So at the height of the system in Australia, 23 million people in the population, 12.5 people in the working economy, FOM at 2.9 Aussie dollars. At the height of the system, it had 31 million accounts. By the end of next year, we'll be down to 21. And the incidence of multiple accounts, multiple insurances, and fees and erosion of retirement balances has been a huge problem, which we're currently addressing.
Okay.
I would import universal compulsory coverage.
Greg, have you?
Yeah, I would look to moving to a system, and Mark's qualifications are worth discussing, but we don't have time, where anyone managing money in the workplace system on a member's behalf has to operate under a fiduciary obligation. Mark mentioned Anna Karenina. I always think of the line in Anna Karenina about pension systems. Happy families are happy in their own way. Unhappy families are unhappy in different ways. And every system, as Martin says, is problems. But if we have a situation in the UK where the average person isn't engaged in pensions and won't be, then you have to have that member-first governance. You can't get away from that if you're interested in an efficient system.
Okay, thank you. We haven't got very long, but I do want to quickly visit the men and women difference, the gender inequality. What are your suggestions about how we fix that?
There's been a number of suggestions in Australia. So the average difference in median balance between men and women in Australia is 40,000. So our median balance at the moment for a man is 148,000. I think for a woman it just drops mid-90s. And it's primarily associated with the gender pay gap. Despite the fact that we've had, gender equality wage legislation, it's there. A number of organisations, I think one of the big things for us is reduce the 450 threshold. So we have a 450 threshold per month, which we think impacts women unduly. So we think from the first dollar superannuation to be deducted and paid. Paid parental leave and potentially catch-up contributions by employers, I think, would make a big difference. But the reality is that this is, I think, a feature of DC systems. And the challenge is that it's very, very expensive on women, that the burden of childcare and later on care for elderly parents is falling asymmetrically to women.
Okay. I think there's a couple of things in the UK right away. That, of course, is absolutely true. Steve Webb this morning made the point. It reflects labour market inequalities. The pension system's a function of that. But there's practical things. The first would be, and I think I mentioned this yesterday on stage, to bring the earnings trigger for auto-enrolment down to the national insurance primary threshold of £8,500. That would bring in 500,000 low earners, of whom three-quarters would be women. We know that low earners are more likely to be women than men, and that's the EE challenge. There's then a more fundamental thing, and it takes us back to the second state pension. Actually, the principle had been agreed, conceded by government in the 2000s around the second state pension, that caring was an economic activity and therefore should be credited in the second state pension. Auto-enrolment has replaced that second state pension, but that principle has not been carried across. I think that's where the real action is. Should we have in the auto-enrolment system contributions made on behalf of those who leave the workforce to care? And that principle was agreed in the 2000s. Can we get round the complexities, mostly the cost, to re-establish the principle in practice. Really critical.
Okay, thanks, Catherine.
I would echo these. As you know, the US is abysmally low on the list of OECD countries in terms of paid leave. But the issue of caring for elders, older adults, is in many people's lived experience day to day. And I think the more that becomes lived reality, that will engender the political will, I'm optimistic about this, to credit that work, because it is work. The other piece of the women's wealth gap, which goes beyond the pay gap that bears addressing, is inherited wealth and how that is passed from generation to generation or not. For first-time college goers in the United States, that wealth tends to be shared, and there are redistributive pressures on newly acquired wealth. And so the ability to really put bounds around newly acquired wealth so that women can pass on that wealth to the next generation is something that public policy has yet to address, but can address, I think, through a DC system.
Okay, thank you. Unbelievably, we are out of time. I could have talked on loads of this material for ages. We will just close on one last question, just because I quite like this question, but we'll keep the answers short. So the question was, and I'm going to just embellish it a little bit, if you had to move to any other country and magically be able to speak both their language and have full accrual, which country would you go to on the basis of their pension system?
I'd go to Australia. You know, Martin's pointed out the challenges, but that's a very effective system. I can speak the language.
Sorry, what was that?
And I would join one of the profit-to-member funds very happily.
I'm just looking for a ticket to Australia. So no, no, I would say I think that's the leader, and the language barrier is quite low.
Happy to answer questions offline, by the way, now that we've run out of questions. So my wife's French Italian. The children were born in France. They hold 3 passports. They have no sense of nationality, and they used to take their identity as Europeans, and they were very upset when you voted the way you did. From my point of view, I think for me, the country I want to go to is the country that doesn't talk about adequacy, but has a tangible sense of what its aspiration is for retirement. Ironically, I don't think retirement's a happy retirement, and let me just personalize this. My mum and dad live in the west of Ireland on an age pension. And I think the most important thing they have is, he in particular has a very purposeful retirement. And I think all over these days, the one thing that we need to start thinking about, and I think this is part of it, is how do we create purposeful retirements? We have the capacity to have adequate retirement income. We have a surplus, most of us have a surplus of assets. We may not want to, move away from our estate planning around the family home, but most of us will have the assets to have a comfortable financial retirement. I think ironically the challenge is finding that sense of purpose in retirement. And I think for me, I'd like to live in the country that cracks that question of what is our aspiration and sense of what is the purpose of retirement. Because it can't be about recreation.
That's a really good answer. A long answer, but a very good answer.